Apollo 11 is man's first attempt to demonstrate the ability to go to the moon, to land there, and to return to Earth. The phrase "one small step for a man, one giant leap for humanity" will always be etched in history. Neil Armstrong was easily the biggest poster boy for the United States space triumph after he famously became the first man to walk on the moon, and then he left the world a cryptic message. The moon landing in the 1960s was a remarkable achievement. However, there are some lessons and echoes of that achievement that are confusing. Not only have we forgotten the specifics, but we have also forgotten the overall storyline. Neil Armstrong's family has finally confirmed what we have figured out. What do they know that you don't know? What precisely was difficult about it? Join us as we explore what happened after Neil Armstrong's death and what they've just confirmed about the moon landing. After Armstrong's death at the age of 82 in 2012, people around the globe paused to honor his life and the impact he had as commander of the Apollo 11 NASA mission. But following the 50th anniversary of Armstrong's famous first steps on the moon, the circumstances surrounding his passing have come to light. According to the New York Times, Armstrong's family received $6 million in a clandestine payment from Mercy Health Fairfield Hospital in 2014. Not only does the Times story publicize the settlement, but it also verifies that Armstrong's family received payment in connection with a wrongful death and survivor claim. Since their father's death, Armstrong's sons have blamed the hospital's medical staff, claiming that the astronaut died as a result of their negligence following his coronary bypass operation. His second wife, Carol Armstrong, said he was amazingly resilient after surgery, but serious problems developed soon after. According to the Times, Armstrong's blood pressure dropped and he started bleeding internally when nurses attempted to remove the wires from his temporary pacemaker. Armstrong was declared deceased on August 25, 2012, after further difficulties. Armstrong was buried at sea a couple of weeks later on September 14 of that year. The settlement agreement also refers to Armstrong as Ned Anderson, a pseudonym. No institution wants to be remotely associated with the death of one of America's greatest heroes. On July 20, 1969, 500 million people, a sixth of the world's population at the time, watched a ghostly black-and-white television image as Armstrong backed down the ladder of the lunar landing ship Eagle, planted his left foot on the moon's surface, and said, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." His fellow astronaut Buzz Aldrin joined him 20 minutes later, and the world watched in awe as the two men spent the next 2 hours bobbing around in the moon's light gravity, collecting rock samples, setting up experiments, and taking now iconic photographs. Michael Collins, the third crew member, was in orbit above in the Apollo 11 command ship Columbia. During Kennedy's challenge, Armstrong was a 30-year-old test pilot flying the X-15 rocket plane for the newly formed National Aeronautics and Space Administration. He had previously served as a naval aviator in the Korean War, flying 78 missions, and had an engineering degree from Purdue University. Armstrong was married to the former Jan Sharon and lived near Edwards Air Force Base in the high desert of California. NASA already had 7 astronauts flying its Mercury space capsule. In 1962, it sent out word that it was looking for more, and Armstrong was one of the 9 it selected. On March 16, 1966, he became the first American civilian to orbit the Earth, commanding the 2-man Gemini 8 mission with David R. Scott as his crewmate. During their 4th orbit, they accomplished the first-ever docking in space, a maneuver that would be necessary for the Apollo missions to land astronauts on the moon. The spacecraft started to lose control a few minutes later, likely due to a malfunctioning maneuvering thruster. This was a perilous moment. The 6,000-pound craft was traveling at 17,500 miles per hour and was spinning and turning end over end once every second. Armstrong ended the emergency by using a second set of thrusters. Mission Control ordered the astronauts to land as soon as possible, and after 10 hours of flight, they splashed down safely in the Pacific. With the 2 astronauts praised for their composure under pressure, Project Apollo got underway, and Armstrong was given command of one of the first 6 flights. This wasn't groundbreaking news back then. NASA had a system for alternating crews among missions, so one would serve as backup and then fly 3 flights later. No one knew how many test flights would be required before the first moon landing could be attempted. Armstrong, along with Buzz Aldrin and Fred Haise Jr., was named to the backup crew for Apollo 9, the third manned test of the new moonship. Soon Apollo 9 was swapped with Apollo 8, and Apollo 8 was then sent to take astronauts around the moon. The mission was a success. While it was still in progress, Chief Astronaut Deke Slayton took Armstrong aside and told him that he, Aldrin, and Mike Collins would fly Apollo 11. Apollo the 11th of May have been a dry run for the first lunar landing if the flight sequence had been reversed or if problems had arisen on Apollo 9 or 10. Neil Armstrong became one of the most renowned figures of the 20th century as a result of sheer chance. After successful rehearsals in May 1969, the next mission would be Apollo 11, which drew a swarm of reporters encircling Armstrong and drawing over 1 million spectators to the Florida coast for the liftoff early on the morning of July 16, 1969. Before the sun came up, Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin were roused from their slumber and hoisted into the Apollo 11 command ship, which was perched atop the Saturn V rocket, which was 363 foot tall. Assuming a perfect liftoff, the astronauts reached lunar orbit 3 days later, and on July 20, with Collins in command of the command ship Columbia, Armstrong and Aldrin boarded the landing craft Eagle to slow down toward the moon's surface, with the goal of a landing site on the Sea of Tranquility, a relatively level plain close to the moon's equator. In retrospect, Armstrong noted that he noticed trouble as they neared the lunar surface. On final approach, the Eagle computer had directed them straight toward a crater filled with boulders the size of cars, so he took over manual control, hosed out more fuel, and skittered a few hundred feet above the surface of the moon in his pursuit of a clear landing spot. After ensuring that Eagle was in fine condition for the return journey, Armstrong and Aldrin donned their cumbersome backpacks and got ready to open the hatch. Later, Armstrong would declare that he thought the landing was a much larger challenge and accomplishment than actually walking on the surface. Armstrong walked on the moon for 2 hours and 21 minutes, Aldrin for about half an hour less. They took rock samples, set up 2 experiments, received a phone call from President Nixon, and planted an American flag, a challenge because the flagstaff wouldn't stand firmly in the lunar dirt, and the flag itself, stiffened with wires, rumpled all while bouncing around in the weak lunar gravity. Reporting that it was great fun but a little hard to stop. One of the ironies of the space age is that nearly all the still photographs from the Apollo 11 moonwalk were taken by Armstrong and not by Aldrin because Armstrong had a camera installed on the chest of his spacesuit and had captured some of the most iconic pictures of the century. After a fitful night's sleep, the 2 men lifted off from the lunar surface and rejoined Collins in Columbia. They splashed down safely in the Pacific on July 24, 1969. They were greeted by ticker-tape parades and a beaming President Nixon. Following this, Armstrong did his best to return to his private life. He was appointed to the panels that investigated the Apollo 13 accident and the Challenger disaster, as well as served for a few years as a manager for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration in Washington, D.C. He taught engineering at the University of Cincinnati, close to his birthplace, and served on corporate boards. He declined almost all requests for interviews and stopped giving autographs when people sold them for thousands of dollars. Here, though, is information regarding the Apollo mission that you were unaware of. The moon has a smell. It is no air, but it has a smell. Each pair of Apollo astronauts to land on the moon tramped lots of moon dust back into the lunar module. It was deep gray, fine-grained, and extremely clingy, and when they unsnapped their helmets, Neil Armstrong said, "We were aware of a new scent in the air of the cabin that clearly came from all the material that had accumulated on and in our clothes." To him, it was the scent of wet ashes. To his Apollo 1 crewmate Buzz Aldrin, it was the smell in the air after a firecracker has gone off. All the astronauts who walked on the moon noticed it, and many commented on it to mission control. Harrison Schmitt, the geologist who flew on Apollo 17, the last lunar landing, said after his second moonwalk, "Smells like someone's been firing a carbine in here." Almost unaccountably, no one had warned lunar module pilot Jim Irwin about the dust. When he took off his helmet inside the cramped lunar module cabin, he said, "There's a funny smell in here." His Apollo 15 crewmate Dave Scott said, "Yeah, I think that's the lunar dirt smell. Never smelled lunar dirt before, but we got most of it right here with us. The moon smells like spent gunpowder." To the chagrin of the scientists, the moonwalkers lost most of that gunpowder smell after they returned to Earth. It was most likely an unstable compound that quickly decayed into a more common odor. Therefore, We will never get the genuine scent of the moon again until we go back. Will we make it to Mars? The Apollo program taught us the way to Mars was complicated. If you had asked anyone involved in the Apollo program, from astronauts to mission controllers to administrators, they would have told you they were working on getting humanity to Mars. They even had the spacecraft designs to prove it. When NASA retired the moon-faring Saturn V rocket in 1972, it was working on the Saturn VB, which would have carried astronauts to Mars by the early 1980s. The 50-year gap in human spaceflight to other worlds is partially due to NASA's success with Apollo. The race to the moon was a political response to the Soviet Union's early successes in space. When Apollo achieved its goal in 1969, political interest in space exploration quickly waned, and funding for human spaceflight dried up. We also learned that humans could live and work in space for a long time. Because of NASA's success with Apollo, the space program lost its immediate political and financial backing, which is necessary to carry out a long-term plan to send humans to Mars. At the height of the Apollo program in 1966, NASA consumed nearly 4.5% of the federal budget. Today, NASA gets less than 1/10 of that. The experience of Apollo made it abundantly clear that NASA could not carry out a Mars mission on its own. It needed international collaboration. Fortunately, we have since demonstrated that we can live and work in space for long periods. The construction and continuous operation of the International Space Station, ISS, have proven that humans can live and work in space for a long time. The ISS has been continuously occupied for over 20 years, and its crew members have demonstrated the ability to carry out complex scientific experiments, repair and upgrade equipment, and live in microgravity for months. The challenges of sending humans to Mars are significant, but they are not insurmountable. The experience gained from Apollo, the ISS, and other space missions has provided valuable lessons that can be applied to future Mars missions. One of the biggest challenges is the long duration of the mission. A round trip to Mars could take up to 3 years, with astronauts spending several months on the Martian surface. This requires careful planning and preparation to ensure that the crew has everything they need to survive and thrive during the mission. Another challenge is the harsh environment of Mars. The planet has a thin atmosphere, extreme temperatures, and high levels of radiation. These conditions require advanced technology and engineering to protect the crew and enable them to carry out their mission. Despite these challenges, NASA is actively working on plans for human missions to Mars. The agency's Artemis program aims to return astronauts to the Moon by 2024, with the goal of using the Moon as a stepping stone for future Mars missions. International partnerships and collaboration with private companies will be crucial in achieving this goal. Ultimately, the lessons learned from Apollo and subsequent space missions have paved the way for future exploration of Mars and beyond. The spirit of innovation, determination, and collaboration that drove the Apollo program continues to inspire and guide us as we embark on new frontiers in space exploration.